Thank you very much. So, I mean, just very briefly to answer the question, I think, yes, there is a role for Europe to play within the Korean conflict and also within the North Korean nuclear issue. I do think, however, that we do need to be very realistic about what the prospects are and what the challenges are. As Dr. Otsuka alluded to, we are in 2024 in a very in some ways unprecedented sort of climate in which I don't remember a time since I've been looking at these issues when certainly relations between the North and the South of Korea and between the North and the United States have been more fractious and tenuous. And of course, at the same time, the DPRK has found this kind of, well, I mean, it has a long history, but it's recently renewed its relations with Russia in this context of the increasing bloc formation of the so-called new Cold War. And of course, with Russia, the DPRK does not have to contend with all these uncertainties that it has with the United States and elsewhere with their electoral cycles and changes in policies. But then even if we look at Europe, I mean, if we're talking about, for example, the EU as an organization, as a supranational organization, it doesn't have really a good record, I think, in terms of its approach to North Korea. Officially termed critical engagement, I mean, at least since the early 2000s, the emphasis has been on the critical, not on the engagement, and it's pretty much aligned itself with the United States and relied on sanctions as a tool of dealing, if you like, with North Korea. And as we can see, as we know, this has not been particularly successful. And of course, things are getting more and more challenging with the Russia-Ukraine war and the fact that the DPRK has become, by most reports, a significant supplier of arms to Russia is not generating a great deal of goodwill within Europe, certainly not within the EU. So those are some of the challenges. And of course, there are also challenges about what kind of deal, if we're talking about denuclearization, is feasible with the DPRK. In the blurb for this event, there was some reference to the precedent of the JCPOA with Iran as being a potential way forward with the DPRK. But of course, the DPRK and Iran are in quite sort of different situations where the DPRK, by most reports, has numerous nuclear warheads already, right? A much more difficult situation to kind of reverse and move along towards denuclearization. And also, you know, I mean, certainly, as with the JCPOA, I think there's a role that Europe can play in carrying some of the you know, the back channels, the kind of negotiations that would be needed to reach a deal. But ultimately, you know, the carrots that need to be held out to the DPRK is going to include the lifting of sanctions. Now, the EU, of course, has its own sanctions, but they're not nearly as significant as those that have been imposed by the United Nations Security Council. And with the US as a permanent member, that's going to have to involve the US in the formation of any deal. Although, as with the case of Iran, of course, a deal that could be conceivable under a Trump administration, for example, could be a way of kind of ensuring and protecting against a subsequent change of administration towards, you know, an administration that is not so keen on this deal. So there are obvious advantages to that kind of deal. You know, there's a lot of uncertainties there, and you know, I want to be optimistic about the possibilities, but of course we don't know. There's a lot we don't know about what North Korea's sort of red lines are, for example, how serious it is about regarding South Korea as a hostile state and giving up on the goal of improvement of relations to the US. And so that's where Europe's role really comes in, I think, in terms of leading the kind of behind the scenes, the track 1.5, track 2 negotiations, which will be precisely about that, about seeing what the room for maneuver is. And of course, Europe has a good record in that regard. At the level of the individual states of some of the individual states of Europe. So I think there's certainly a potential to see what is the reality and what is the room for maneuver behind the official rhetoric, which is coming from the DPRK, which does seem quite bleak and closing of possibilities. Now, that's much of that is related to North Korea's nuclear program, but of course that's not the only issue. One other thing I would mention, where I think Europe can certainly play a role, is in the area of humanitarian assistance and aid, and I think most, if not all, of the humanitarian NGOs that have a presence on the ground, or at least did until the pandemic, were European. At the moment, none of those have been able to re-enter the DPRK. Presumably, there are going to be some very difficult and complex negotiations about how that will happen. First of all, the UN organizations would need to re-enter. There would need to be an assessment, a joint needs assessment carried out by those organizations before these other humanitarian organizations can get back into the country. So there's some kind of difficult negotiations that will have to take place, and of course the DPRK will have to formally request that those organizations re-enter the country, and there'll be debates about the size of the in-person presence on the ground, and also a very a conversation or a challenge within Europe that because of the huge needs in Gaza and in Ukraine, how do we also emphasize the need for humanitarian assistance within the DPRK as well, in a context in which there's already quite a lot of fatigue amongst donors vis-a-vis the UK. So just to sum up then, I would say yes, there's definitely a role, and it's based on Europe's experience in terms of its relations with the DPRK historically, but also we shouldn't shy away from some of the very significant challenges. So I will leave it there, and yeah, happy to hear questions.